Margot Shaw thought the hardest part of flying to Lake Como would be watching Jake move on. She was wrong. Because before the week was over, she would discover that the person she trusted most in the world had been hiding an entire life from her. The thing about 7-year friendships was that they stopped feeling remarkable. They became part of the architecture of your life, instead. Margot found out about Jake and Denise's engagement one afternoon. Sarah hadn't meant for it to be a surprise. The problem was that she lived 3 states away and had spent the last 6 months planning a wedding while assuming everyone important already knew. Margot found out the way people often discover the things that quietly rearrange the furniture of their lives. Accidentally, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. She didn't cry. She made tea she didn't drink. Sat on the couch in her Philadelphia apartment with the television on and the volume off. Then she ignored 3 text messages from Gammon. The 4th was less patient. Answer your phone. Despite herself, she smiled. A minute later it rang. You've reached Margot Shaw, she said. Please leave a message after the tone. You sound terrible. Hello to you too. What happened? She stared at the wall. There was a reason she'd spent 7 years talking to him. Gammon had an irritating ability to identify problems from several time zones away. Jake's engaged. Silence. Not surprise. Just silence. Then, have you eaten? She laughed. Actually laughed. A sharp, unexpected sound in the middle of an otherwise miserable evening. I had half a cereal bar. That's not eating. No, but it is technically food. It isn't. He sounded deeply offended by the suggestion. And somehow that helped. They spent the next 2 hours talking about everything except Jake. Which, she would later realize, was exactly what she needed. There had been a night freshman year that she would remember later as the beginning of everything. Margot worked evenings at the campus library circulation desk, mostly because the hours fit around her classes and partly because she enjoyed the quiet. The library after 10 o'clock belonged to a different species of student entirely. The desperate, the over-prepared, and the people who had nowhere else they particularly wanted to be. Gammon fell into the 3rd category. At least, that was her working theory. For nearly a month she watched him occupy the same corner table on the 3rd floor. He arrived alone, studied alone, left alone. He never joined the loud clusters of students spreading textbooks across entire tables. Never lingered for conversations. Never seemed especially interested in being known. One evening near midterms, she was making her final sweep before closing when she found him still sitting there. The lights in half the floor had already dimmed. Outside the tall windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. He wasn't studying. His laptop was closed. His books were stacked neatly beside him. He was simply sitting there, staring out into the darkness. Libraries closed. He looked up. For a second, he seemed genuinely surprised to find another person in the room. I know. Then why are you still here? A pause. I'm thinking. Margot folded her arms. You look terrible at it. For the first time since she'd known him, he laughed. Not much. Just enough to transform him. It softened something in his face she hadn't realized was always held too tightly. That's fair, he admitted. She should have kept walking. Instead she sat down across from him. What are you thinking about? He considered the question. Home. Where's home? California. She frowned. That's not very far. Another small laugh. Far enough. Something in the way he said it made her think there was more to the answer than geography. She didn't push. Instead she told him about growing up 20 minutes from campus and never having lived anywhere else. He told her about terrible dining hall food. She complained about economics professors who treated sleep deprivation like a learning objective. He listened. By the time they left the library together, the rain had stopped. The campus was mostly empty. They were halfway across the parking lot when a group of fraternity boys stumbled out from between 2 buildings, loud with alcohol and misplaced confidence. One of them called something after Margot. Another stepped into their path. She immediately felt the familiar tightening in her stomach. Not fear exactly. Just the weary calculation every woman learns sooner or later. How annoying is this going to become? Before she could answer, Gammon moved. Not quickly. Not aggressively. He simply stepped forward. The conversation stopped. The fraternity boys looked at him. Gammon looked back. There was no threat in his expression. No anger. No challenge. Just complete, unwavering stillness. Something passed between them that Margot couldn't identify. A moment later, one of the boys muttered something under his breath. Another laughed awkwardly. Then, with surprising speed, the entire group decided they had somewhere else to be. Margot watched them disappear across the parking lot. What was that? Gammon slipped his hands into his pockets. What was what? You just stared at them. They left. They were always going to leave. She looked at him suspiciously. I don't think that's true. A corner of his mouth lifted. Most people don't actually want trouble. They resumed walking. A few steps later he added quietly, the trick is knowing which ones do. She glanced at him. There was something strange about that answer. Not frightening. Just older than the rest of him somehow. When they reached her dorm building, she turned toward the entrance. Thanks. Of course. An awkward silence settled between them. Neither seemed particularly eager to leave. Finally Margot held out her hand. Phone. His eyebrows lifted. My phone? Yes. Your phone. After a moment, he handed it over. She entered her number and gave it back. There. What is this for? If you're going to keep lurking in dark libraries after closing, somebody should occasionally verify you're alive. For a second, he simply looked at her. Then he smiled. A real one this time. Small. Unexpected. Entirely worth the effort. Years later, when she tried to identify the exact moment Gong Gammon had become one of the most important people in her life, she would think it might have been that smile. Or perhaps it had started even earlier. Perhaps it had started the moment she'd sat down. They spent the rest of college orbiting each other with surprising consistency. What began as late-night conversations in the library became shared study sessions, take-out dinners, walks across campus, and the easy familiarity of two people who discovered, almost accidentally, that they preferred each other's company to most alternatives. Somewhere along the way, texting became daily. Calls became routine. Friendship became habit. Gammon remained difficult for most people to read. Quiet in a way that often registered as arrogance until you spent enough time around him to understand it was something else entirely. A kind of stillness, deliberate and deep, like water that doesn't move on the surface because everything interesting is happening somewhere far below. Margot never found him difficult at all. She thought he was sweet. She thought he was a little lonely. She thought, in the way you think things about people you're not paying close enough attention to, that he was a quiet middle-class kid doing his best. She was wrong about the last part. He never corrected her. 7 years later, she still thought he worked in consulting. He let her. What she knew about his life was what she could see. The video calls, the thoughtful texts, the steady, anchoring presence that asked nothing of her and offered everything. What she didn't know was the rest of it, and the rest of it was considerable, and he kept it from her deliberately, and without guilt, because she was the only place in his life where he could simply be a person, rather than a force of nature that people arrange themselves around. He had held on to that with both hands. He had held on to her with both hands, quietly, for 7 years, from a careful and respectful distance, because she had never looked at him that way, and he would rather have her as she was than lose her trying to become something more. It was, she would later understand, an extraordinary act of discipline from a man who was accustomed to taking what he wanted. The final wedding itinerary arrived a few weeks before departure. Seeing Jake's name on it shouldn't have bothered her. 5 years was a long time to build your life around someone, however, and less than a year was apparently not enough time to forget it. He would be attending with Denise. A name that still entered conversation like a small, well-dressed injury. Margot stared at the itinerary longer than necessary, the neat formatting and cheerful fonts doing nothing to soften the impact. Then sat back on her couch, feeling the familiar ache settle in. Not sharp, not dramatic, just the dull, persistent reminder of something that had once mattered too much. Margot had not dated anyone since Jake. Not because no one had asked. Because she hadn't yet rebuilt the part of herself that believed it was worth the risk. The part Jake had damaged when he told her, at the end, that he'd stayed as long as he had out of respect for his sister. 2 months after that, Denise had a ring. Everyone knew. Everyone at this wedding would know. Everyone would look at her with that softness people reserve for women they feel sorry for, and she would smile and hold it together and be the dependable, warm, steady Margot that everyone expected, and she would die quietly inside. Unless. Free trip to Lake Como, she said, during a video call, watching Gammon's expression do the thing it did when he was listening properly. A certain quality of attention, like the whole of him, was organized around hearing her. Luxury resort. A week. All expenses paid. You just be my +1. I don't do weddings. Too cool for me. One eyebrow, barely. Is there no one else? They all know everyone. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her cardigan tighter. You're the only one they won't question. You're the only one who won't be a whole thing. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll think about it. The next morning, before her alarm, "Send me the details." She shrieked into her pillow for approximately 30 seconds, and then sent him the itinerary. She got to the resort first, which was a mistake she recognized immediately upon arrival. The villa sat at the edge of Lake Como like something that had been dreamed rather than built, all pale stone, and climbing roses and terraced gardens descending to water so blue it looked invented. It was obscenely, aggressively beautiful, the kind of place that made you feel briefly guilty for being mortal. Margot stood at the entrance with her single sensible suitcase, and tried not to look overwhelmed. Sarah found her in 45 seconds, and made a sound that startled a nearby sparrow. They were mid-embrace, Sarah's mother reaching for Margot's face with both hands, the familiar warmth of the Whitfield family settling around her like something she'd always fit inside. When the second car arrived, Denise stepped out first. Blonde, immaculate, the kind of beautiful that seems designed for documentation. Already talking about the suite her father had arranged. The presidential suite, she explained to no one in particular, while Jake smiled tightly beside her. The one where Brian Kincaid, the famous movie star, had stayed twice. Where the Duke of Something had spent a honeymoon. Where you had to book months in advance through a special inquiry, and even then, darling, they didn't just let anyone have it. Margot smiled until she felt the muscles in her jaw begin to quietly protest. And then a car pulled up, and the resort went slightly quiet. It was an involuntary quiet, the kind that happens not because someone made noise, but because someone carried a quality of presence that rearranged the atmosphere of a space without announcing itself. Gammon stepped out, and Margot felt the change before she fully processed what she was seeing. He was not the college boy she kept in her memory. He was different. Not unrecognizable, but clarified somehow, as though distance had blurred certain details and reality had quietly restored them. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt that fit across his shoulders with the kind of precision that was either bespoke or a miracle, and he moved through the resort entrance the way water moves downhill, with a calm, inevitable authority that required no effort. He was tall, broader than she remembered, with the stillness of a man who knows that every room will adjust to him and has long since stopped acknowledging it. He was extraordinarily, almost aggressively, good-looking. Margot already knew that, of course. 7 years of video calls had made the fact difficult to miss. What the calls had failed to communicate was presence. In person, he seemed larger somehow, sharper, more substantial. Margot's brain performed a brief, startled recalibration. He found her eyes before he found anything else in the courtyard. He crossed to her without hurry, kissed her cheek like he had done it 1,000 times, and said quietly against her ear, "You look like you needed rescuing." "I was fine. You were calculating exit routes." She laughed before she could stop herself, and something in the assembled group shifted. The pity in the looks around her tilted, rearranged into something more like curiosity, and Jake, standing by the luggage with Denise still mid-monologue about the suite, went briefly, satisfyingly still. The group drifted toward the reception desk in a loose cluster of luggage and overlapping conversations. Sarah's mother was explaining the rehearsal schedule. Denise was interrogating the concierge about room categories like she was negotiating a ceasefire. Margot fell half a step behind, watching the chaos. Gammon was already moving. Not directing. Not inserting himself. Just noticing. A garment bag slipped from a luggage cart. He caught it without looking, handing it back with a small nod. Sarah's father patted his pockets, muttering about a missing room key. Gammon pointed to the breast pocket of his jacket before the man even realized he'd checked the wrong one. Sarah's mother mentioned she'd forgotten her wrap for the evening breeze. Gammon vanished for 30 seconds and returned with the cardigan she'd left draped over a suitcase handle. None of it was dramatic. None of it was showy. It was the accumulation of 100 small observations, each one so natural it almost didn't register. But Margot noticed. She watched him for a moment, arms folded, head tilted. "When did you become so competent?" she asked. He glanced over, expression unreadable. "I've always been competent. You were locked out of your dorm room 3 times in 1 week. That was a strategic testing exercise." She snorted. "Of what?" "Your patience." "Of yours." Her laugh slipped out before she could stop it. His mouth twitched, the smallest smile, there and gone. And for some reason, she found herself looking at him a second longer than usual. As though the man she'd spent 7 years talking to had quietly become someone she hadn't fully caught up with. The receptionist smiled the moment they approached the desk. "Welcome back, Mr. Gong. We're delighted to have you with us again." Margot glanced sideways. The receptionist was already handing over key cards. No verification. No reservation number. No typing. Just immediate recognition. Gammon accepted the cards with a polite nod. Thank you. The woman's smile warmed. We've prepared Laurent exactly as requested. We hope you'll find everything satisfactory. Only when they stepped away did Margot turn toward him. What was that? What was what? They knew your name before you said it. I've stayed here before. She stared. How many times? A few. A few? He shrugged. It's a nice hotel. Margot snorted. Most people don't casually revisit five-star resorts in Italy. Most people don't voluntarily eat gas station sandwiches during road trips. Those sandwiches are excellent. They're a health code violation. The porter led them through the villa, up a private lift, and down a corridor that felt increasingly detached from the rest of civilization. By the third set of doors, Margot was beginning to suspect they were no longer staying in the same hotel as everyone else. When the doors finally opened, Margot stopped walking. The suite was ridiculous. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Fresh flowers on polished tables. A terrace stretching the entire length of the suite. Somewhere in the distance, water moved against the shoreline. Gammon. He looked amused. Yes. This is not a hotel room. No. This is a small nation. His smile widened. The suite contained 3 bedrooms, 2 sitting rooms, a dining area larger than her entire apartment kitchen, and enough marble to build a courthouse. Margot slowly turned in a circle. Absolutely not. What? We are getting separate rooms. Gammon looked genuinely confused. Why? Because we're adults. We're pretending not to be. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Annoyingly, he had a point. You expect people to believe we flew to Italy together and immediately requested separate rooms? I hate when you're logical. So do I. She folded her arms. You planned this. I planned for practicality. You planned for mischief. A pause. Both can be true. She pointed toward the hallway. I'm taking the furthest bedroom. Good. She blinked. Good. His expression remained perfectly innocent. You snore. Margot gasped. I do not. You absolutely do. I absolutely do not. Freshman year. Economics midterms. That was one nap. It was memorable. She threw a decorative pillow at him. He caught it without effort. And for the first time since arriving in Italy, Margot stopped thinking about Jake, Denise, weddings, pitying relatives, and everything else waiting for her outside those doors. She was too busy trying to understand how her best friend had somehow secured a suite that looked like it belonged to a movie star. Gammon, meanwhile, seemed to find the entire thing completely unremarkable. Check-in went smoothly for everyone except Denise, who discovered, at the front desk in full view of an audience, that the suite her father had booked months in advance, Suite Laurent, the jewel of the property, the one she had mentioned to approximately everyone within a 10-meter radius, had been released to a confirmed VIP guest. The staff were apologetic. Deeply apologetic. Almost reverent. The suite, they explained delicately, was reserved for a particular tier of guest, and availability for other bookings was only extended when those guests were confirmed absent. By dinner, Denise's smile had acquired the brittle shine of someone recovering from a personal betrayal. The hotel gave us a beautiful alternative suite, she said for the 3rd time. Sarah's father frowned. I thought you said you had Laurent. We did. A pause. Apparently not. Her smile tightened. The hotel released it to a confirmed VIP guest. Sympathetic murmurs circled the table. Denise lifted one shoulder. It's fine. These things happen. They did not, Margot suspected, happen to Denise very often. Who got it? A bridesmaid asked. The concierge wouldn't say. Denise took a sip of wine. But apparently it's someone important. Probably Brian Kincaid. Or one of those actors who buy entire floors and pretend they don't want attention. Margot frowned. Laurent. The name tugged at something. Then the memory surfaced. The concierge. The private lift. The ridiculous terrace. The suite that looked like a small independent nation. Oh no. She slowly lowered her wineglass. The conversation drifted elsewhere. Then someone asked where she and Gammon were staying. The Laurent suite, she said. The table went quiet. Not dramatically. Just long enough to be noticeable. A strange little silence. Denise blinked. I'm sorry. Which suite? Laurent. Margot gestured vaguely. The one with the lake terrace. Nobody said anything. Sarah looked at Gammon. Sarah's father looked at Gammon. Jake looked from Margot to Gammon. For the first time that evening, He appeared genuinely uncertain about something. Even Denise looked at Gammon. Gammon continued eating his dinner. Completely unbothered. I thought Laurent was reserved for VIP guests. Gammon took a sip of wine. Apparently it is. The silence somehow became worse. Margot looked around the table. Everyone appeared to have reached a conclusion she hadn't been invited to. I have absolutely no idea, she said. Which, judging by the expressions around the table, was somehow the wrong answer. A waiter appeared beside Margot's chair. Would you care for wine, miss? She looked up from the menu, mouth opening. Before she could answer, Gammon said, calm as ever, the Sauvignon Blanc. The waiter nodded and moved on. Margot blinked. I haven't ordered yet. You were going to. I was considering my options. No, you weren't. A few people around the table laughed. Sarah's mother. One of the bridesmaids. Even Sarah herself. Margot narrowed her eyes. And how exactly would you know that? Gammon looked genuinely puzzled, like she'd asked why the sky was blue. You order the same wine whenever it's available. She stared at him. You remember that? Another pause. You've been ordering it for 7 years. The answer was so casual, so unforced, that it took a full heartbeat to land. Around them, the table kept moving, Sarah answering questions about the ceremony, Denise discussing sightseeing plans, someone debating gelato flavors. But Margot wasn't listening. She was looking at him. 7 years. 7 years of phone calls, video chats, birthdays, career crises, family dramas, celebrations, disappointments, and ordinary Tuesdays. 7 years of him showing up in ways she never fully noticed. He remembered her wine order. Not because he was trying to impress her. Not because he was performing. But because he'd been paying attention the whole time. She wasn't entirely sure why that felt important. Only that it did. And for the first time all week, she found herself wondering how many other things he'd noticed that she'd never thought to ask about. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Margot stepped onto the terrace. The lake stretched below the villa. Dark, glassy, impossibly still beneath the moonlight. Gammon was already there. Of course he was. He leaned against the railing with one hand in his pocket, shoulders relaxed, gaze fixed on the water like it was speaking to him. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt familiar. Comfortable. The kind of silence that only existed between people who had long since stopped trying to impress each other. You know, she said eventually, normal people don't stand dramatically on balconies overlooking Italian lakes. Good thing neither of us is normal. That's probably true. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. The breeze shifted, brushing her hair across her cheek. She looked at him. Really looked. The sharp line of his profile against the lake. The quiet confidence in the way he occupied space. The strange, steady calm he carried. A calm that felt bigger now, heavier, like something she'd never fully noticed before. Or perhaps had noticed years ago, and then forgotten because screens flattened people into simpler shapes. The combination of moonlight, lake water, and Gammon's profile against both felt faintly unreasonable. Gammon turned slightly. What? I didn't say anything. You made a face. I absolutely did not. You absolutely did. His smile widened. Barely, but enough. Margot looked away first. Which, she realized with mild irritation, almost never happened. On the second night, they swam in the lake after midnight, the water black and warm at the surface, the mountains reflected in it like a photograph of themselves. She was laughing at something he'd said, treading water, when she turned and found him closer than she'd expected, watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for, not yet. Something attentive and quiet and enormously patient. He looked away before she could ask about it. She filed it, and didn't file it, and went back to laughing, and thought about it for a very long time afterward. The night everything shifted began ordinarily enough. There was a club near the water, ambient music, excellent cocktails, the golden, loose-limbed atmosphere of people on holiday from their real lives. Margot was warm from the dancing, and 2 glasses of something Italian and sparkling, and she had not thought about Jake once in 3 hours, which was either a triumph or the wine. Gammon sat at the edge of the group and watched her move through the room with an expression she still didn't have a word for, and when she pulled him onto the floor by the hand, he came without argument, which surprised her, and danced with a controlled, unhurried ease that surprised her more. They left around 1 in the morning, walking back toward the hotel along the lakeside promenade. The evening had turned cool enough to be comfortable, and the crowds had thinned to a scattering of tourists reluctant to surrender the night. The air smelled of jasmine and water. She was mid-sentence about something. She would not remember what, when she felt him change. Not dramatically. Not obviously. He didn't stop walking. But something in the quality of his attention shifted, tightened, reorganized itself, and his hand found the small of her back with a pressure that was different from the evening's casual contact. Steering, not affectionate. She registered the men a moment after he did. 3 of them, in the narrow street behind, not quite keeping pace. Gammon? Keep walking, he said pleasantly, as though they were still mid-conversation. She kept walking. Her heart was doing something percussive and unhelpful. She opened her mouth to ask what they were going to do, and then the men closed the distance, and Gammon turned, and Margot discovered that she did not, in fact, know him. It was over in under a minute. Later, Margot would replay it in her head, trying to locate the moment she could have intervened, or screamed, or run, and come up with nothing. It had been too fast. Too efficient. Too certain. Gammon moved through those 3 men the way a stone moves through still water, with a devastating, unhurried authority that seemed to arrive from some part of him she'd never seen before. There had been no hesitation, no panic, no surprise, as though this wasn't the first time he'd found himself in a situation like this, as though his body already knew what to do. When it was over, he turned back to her. His breathing was steady, his expression unchanged. Are you hurt? Am I? She stared at him. Are you? I'm fine. He cupped her face briefly in both hands, checked her over with quick, clinical attention, then stepped back. His breathing had barely changed. Let's go back. Gammon. What just happened? A misunderstanding. His voice was perfectly level. One that's been handled. She looked at him standing there, unhurried, unruffled, the undisturbed surface of him, and thought, I don't know who you are. She didn't say it. Not yet. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Jake caught her alone near the bar. Not aggressively. Not even intentionally, probably. Jake had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to wander into her orbit and assume he belonged there. Hey. Hey. For a moment they simply looked at each other. 5 years was a long time. Long enough that seeing him still triggered a strange lag in her brain. A moment where memory arrived before reality. You look good, Margot. There was genuine warmth in his voice. The annoying thing was that there usually had been. Thanks. I'm glad you came. She laughed softly. I helped plan the wedding, Jake. Right. Yeah. A faint smile. He shifted his glass. They watched the lake through the open terrace doors. I wasn't sure if you would. The admission caught her off guard. Why wouldn't I? Jake looked uncomfortable. I don't know. A pause. Everything. Margot stared at him. Everything. 5 years together. A breakup. An engagement less than a year later. Everything. The fact that he could compress all of it into a single word felt strangely appropriate. I almost didn't, she admitted. Something flickered across his face. Relief, regret, possibly both. I'm sorry. The word surprised her. Not because she hadn't wanted them once. Because she wasn't entirely sure what they meant now. Sorry for what? Jake looked down at his drink. When everything ended. Another pause. You deserved better than how I handled that. Margot said nothing. He wasn't wrong. The problem was that he still sounded like someone discussing an administrative error. A scheduling conflict. An unfortunate misunderstanding. Not the collapse of a future they'd spent years building. Jake exhaled. I just thought you'd bounce back faster. There it was. Not cruelty. Not malice. Just Jake. The same Jake who had always assumed she was stronger than everyone else. The same Jake who mistook resilience for invulnerability. The same Jake who leaned on her without ever realizing she might need somewhere to lean to. Margot felt something unexpected settle quietly inside her. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Understanding. The kind that arrives after grief has finished doing its work. You always do, Jake added. She almost laughed. Because somehow that was the problem. He still didn't understand. She was worried, you know. Margot blinked. Who? Denise. Jake smiled awkwardly. She was worried this weekend would be uncomfortable for you. The statement hung between them. Margot waited. Jake appeared completely unaware he had just made things worse. Of course he was. A familiar exhaustion touched her. Not because she wanted him back. Because she suddenly remembered exactly why she didn't. He seems different. Different how? Jake glanced toward Gammon. Like the sort of person who notices everything. A smile tugged at Margot's mouth. Kind of intense, though. He's lovely. Jake looked unconvinced. Where'd you say he works? She felt Gammon before she saw him. That was the only way she could explain it. A warmth at her back, a subtle reorganization of the air around her. Then his hand settled lightly at her waist. Not possessive. Not performative. Certain. He stood beside her the way a door stands in a frame. Quietly, completely, making exit irrelevant. Jake, Gammon said. Just that. Just the name. Perfectly polite. Somehow colder than the lake outside. Jake blinked. Made a sound somewhere between a greeting and a retreat. Then found somewhere else to be with surprising efficiency. Margot looked up. Gammon looked back. Face unreadable. You didn't have to. I know, he said. I wanted to. The wedding was the kind of beautiful that made cynics quiet and romantics briefly insufferable. Sarah was radiant in a way that Margot felt in her sternum. The uncomplicated joy of watching someone you love become completely, openly happy. She cried during the vows. She was not the only one. Gammon, without comment, produced a handkerchief from his jacket pocket and placed it in her hand, and she pressed it to her face and thought, "This is either very old-fashioned or the most romantic thing anyone has done for me in years," and decided it was probably both and moved on. The reception was where things stopped adding up. The groom's godfather arrived halfway through the evening, a shipping magnate. The sort of man whose name appeared in business magazines and whose phone calls were usually returned immediately. The room noticed. Not dramatically, just in the subtle way people noticed men who owned things. He was silver-haired, polished, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. The kind of wealthy that had settled into his bearing over decades. He greeted the family warmly, made his speech, embarrassed the groom appropriately. Then, crossing the room, he saw Gammon. And stopped. Not dramatically, just long enough to be noticeable. Margot watched the recognition land. The older man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Surprise first. Then calculation. Then something that looked remarkably like caution. He changed direction immediately. Mr. Gong. Gammon looked up from his conversation. The godfather extended a hand. And for the first time all evening, he seemed genuinely pleased to meet someone. We've been trying to arrange a meeting for months. Gammon shook his hand. I know. The older man laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he appeared genuinely relieved. Margot caught fragments after that. An acquisition. 3 countries. A number followed by the word billion. She assumed she'd misheard. Then she heard it again. And again. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. The repercussions lasted all evening. Everywhere the godfather went, pieces of it followed. A conversation with the groom's parents. A quiet exchange with Sarah's mother. A cluster of guests near the dance floor. Lowered voices. Repeated glances. I've been trying to get in front of him for months. No, seriously. I had no idea. Do you know who that is? Margot did not. Which was suddenly becoming a problem. She walked back to the villa with the lake beside her. Her mind doing the quiet, architectural work of rearranging what she knew. Gammon fell into step beside her without being asked. She said, "How much of what I know about you is true?" He stopped walking. The water moved. The night insects made their small, continuous sound. He stood in the gold light from the path lanterns, this man she had known for 7 years, and she watched him decide to stop managing her. "More than you think," he said. "Less than you deserve to know." She waited. "The company is mine," he said. "You've heard of it," he continued. "You just never connected the name. The college story is true. Everything I've ever told you is true." He paused. "The picture is just larger than I let you see." She thought about 7 years of video calls. Late-night conversations about loneliness and ambition, and what you owe the people who shaped you. She thought about the handkerchief. The room service. The 3 men on the cobblestone street. She thought about the careful, deliberate sketch of himself that he had handed her, and how it had felt, all this time, like a whole portrait. "Why?" she asked. "Because," he said, and something moved across his face that she'd never seen there before, not quite vulnerability, but adjacent to it, something that caused him to show, "You were the only person in my life who looked at me and saw a person." His voice was quiet. Everybody else wanted something. The honesty of it landed harder than the revelation about the company. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't want to lose that." She heard it. She also heard what it meant about the decision he'd made. The quiet presumption of it. The choice to manage what she knew because he decided, without asking, what she could carry. "That wasn't your decision to make, Gammon." He didn't argue. He said, "You're right." She went inside. He stayed by the water. She lay on her bed in Sweet Laurent, staring at the ceiling, and felt several things simultaneously. Fury, tenderness, grief for a version of him she'd never actually known, relief that the real one was larger and more complicated and somehow exactly like the person she'd always thought he was. Sleep felt impossible. So did certainty. Outside, Jake found Gammon by the water. "Must be nice," he said. Gammon looked up. Jake gestured vaguely toward the villa, toward the suite, toward everything. "Being able to buy whatever you want." For a moment, nothing happened. Then something in Gammon's expression settled. Not anger. Not irritation. Something colder. Jake's smile faltered. He opened his mouth, appeared to reconsider, and closed it again. Jake Whitfield was not an entirely stupid man. A few seconds later, he found somewhere else to be. The lake took the silence back. Morning came in through the terrace doors in long, pale bars, and with it the clarity that arrives after a night of sitting with something difficult. She found him at breakfast on the villa terrace, coffee in hand, looking out at the lake in the unhurried way of a man who is nowhere he needs to be but who carries the weight of everywhere he has been. He looked up when she appeared. He didn't move toward her or away. He waited, which was, she was beginning to understand, what he always did. The extraordinary patience of someone who had learned that what he wanted was worth waiting for. She sat across from him. "I'm not angry that you have money. I know. I'm angry that you thought I needed to be managed. You're right. Don't agree with everything I say. It's unsettling." The corner of his mouth moved. Something almost warm. "You're also right that it was the best friendship I've ever had, and I was afraid." He looked at her with that quality of attention she'd spent 7 years basking in without understanding its full weight. "You made it feel like I could exist as a person instead of a position. I held on to that too tightly. It became dishonest." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The lake was extraordinary in the morning light, silver and vast, and she was going to tell him the true version now, not the surface one. "Jake didn't just leave me," she said. "He told me he'd stayed as long as he had out of respect for Sarah. Like I was an obligation he'd fulfilled." She kept her eyes on the water. "He was engaged to Denise in 2 months. 2 months, Gammon. And I couldn't figure out what I'd missed. What had been wrong with me the whole time without my knowing." She paused. "I came to this wedding partly for Sarah and partly to prove I was fine. And what I found instead was that I'm fine, but not in the way I planned, because somewhere during this week the performance stopped feeling like a performance, and that terrifies me, because I looked at you on that cobblestone street and realized I don't know who you are." "You know who I am," he said. "You've known me for 7 years. The rest is just context. Very large context." "Yes. A beat." She almost smiled. "I need you to stop making decisions about what I can handle." "Agreed. And I need you to actually tell me things." "Also agreed." She looked at him across the breakfast table. This man who was apparently a billionaire, and also the person who knew she took her coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar and had, she now realized, quietly arranged for it to be available in the suite without being asked. Who had stood on a cobblestone street at 1 in the morning and made 3 men disappear with the calm efficiency of someone completing a routine task. Who had placed a handkerchief in her hand during a wedding ceremony and looked away immediately, as though doing her a kindness required no acknowledgement. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They spent the morning talking. The real talking, not the careful, edited versions they'd been exchanging for years, but the whole, unwieldy, honest architecture of it. The parts of himself he'd spent years keeping separate from her. What his days looked like. What he carried and why he kept her separate from the weight of it, and what it had cost him to watch her talk about Jake for years without being able to say the thing he'd been not saying since sophomore year. "You've wanted me for 7 years, she said slowly, when it finally fully landed. "Yes. And you just didn't. You didn't want that from me. You didn't ask." "No," he said. "I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking now." That afternoon, he took her sailing. She had not expected the yacht. She had not expected the staff of 6 who moved through it with quiet efficiency, or the lunch served on the deck, fresh pasta, lake fish, a wine she would remember for years, or the way he leaned against the railing with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled and looked at her like someone who had stopped pretending he wasn't looking. They went through the towns along the shore, and she trailed her hand in the warm water, and he watched her, and she let him. And when Bellagio appeared around a bend in the lake, pale and stacked and absurd with beauty, she turned to find him already looking at her instead. "You're missing it," she said. "I'm not," he said. She felt it everywhere. The farewell dinner that evening was the last event of the wedding week. The Whitfield family was warm and a little tearful, Sarah was glowing with the particular light of someone who has just married the right person, and Margot arrived at the table with Gammon's hand at her back and felt, for the first time in years, not like the story everyone else was telling about her, but like someone writing her own. Jake was irrelevant. Denise was irrelevant. The looks that came her way had changed so completely that they barely registered. Not pity, not comparison, just the uncomplicated acknowledgement of someone who is, visibly and obviously, exactly where she should be. That night, after the dinner, he kissed her on the balcony with the lake below them and the stars overhead, and several years of careful restraint finally, completely, released. He kissed her like a man who had been patient long enough, and she kissed him back like a woman who had finally stopped being afraid of what she wanted, and then they went inside and closed the door behind them. What happened next was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. He was, in this as in everything, precise and overwhelming and completely, devastatingly attentive, and she discovered that 7 years of held-back wanting, when finally released, produces something that bears almost no resemblance to the cautious, managed thing she'd let herself want before. He learned her like he learned everything. Quietly, thoroughly, as though she were the only subject worth studying, and she arched into him, and forgot Jake, and forgot fear, and forgot everything except the particular way his voice dropped when he said her name, and his hands, patient, thorough, relentless, moved against her skin like they already knew what she needed before she'd named it herself. It was the best night of her life. She told him so, afterward, tucked into the crook of his arm, the lake visible through the open terrace door. He made a sound that she recognized, astonished as pleased. "This is going to be extremely inconvenient," she said, "if you turn out to be terrible in the daylight." "I'm not," he said. She laughed. She believed him. He held her closer, and the lake was very still, and outside the window Lake Como did what it had been doing for centuries, reflecting the sky back at itself, unhurried, patient, complete. A promise. A beginning. The tarmac at Milan Malpensa was silver and sunbright, and the private jet waiting on it was the sort of thing Margot assumed belonged to CEOs, oil heirs, or fictional billionaires, not her best friend who claimed to hate attention. She knew it was his before he said anything. The quiet confirmation in the way the crew straightened when they approached, the same organizational gravity that preceded him everywhere, the smooth, unhurried efficiency of people who were very good at their jobs because their employer demanded nothing less. He'd offered the Whitfields a lift home. Sarah had said yes before he finished the sentence. Sarah's parents had said yes with the enthusiasm of people who have just realized they like their daughter's new person enormously. Jake and Denise had declined. Margot had watched Jake's jaw do something complicated and felt nothing about it whatsoever, which was, she decided, a form of healing. Now she was curled into Gammon's side at 37,000 feet, a blanket pulled up to her chin, his arms steady around her, the week finally settling into something she could hold without dropping. The cabin was quiet. Sarah and her husband were asleep in the seats ahead, Sarah's parents murmuring contentedly over something on a shared screen. Outside the windows there was only cloud and the faint, abstract blue of altitude. "You offered the whole family a lift," she said, not lifting her head. "Yes. In your private jet." It was the logical option. She pressed her face into his shoulder to muffle her laugh. "You take the whole let me give our friends a lift thing to a completely different stratosphere." He said nothing, which was the Gammon version of being pleased. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about the suite and the yacht and the Godfather's startled face, and the number she'd overheard that she still hadn't fully finished processing. "So," she said softly, "how rich are you?" "Exactly." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he laughed. It was the first unguarded laugh she'd ever heard from him. Not the quiet near smile she'd learned to read over 7 years, not the controlled warmth he allowed himself in private moments, but a real laugh, low and unmanaged, surprised out of him by the question, or by her, or by the particular absurdity of this week and everything in it. It changed his face. It made him look like the college boy she'd known, and the man he'd become, and something she didn't have a name for yet, something she thought she'd be spending a very long time learning. "Enough," he said. She smiled into his shoulder. "Enough." She thought she understood that answer. She thought she was beginning to understand him. The whole of him, the context and the person inside it, the ruthless and the gentle, the controlled and the newly, carefully open. She was right that she was beginning. She was wrong that she was close to finished. She would spend years still finding new rooms in him. The loyalty that ran silent and total, the fury he kept leashed, the extraordinary, almost violent tenderness he reserved for her alone. She would find, eventually, the full extent of the life he lived outside the hours they spent together. And she would learn to hold it, not because it wasn't vast, but because she was not as small as either of them had let themselves believe. But that was later. Right now, at 37,000 feet, she was warm and unhurried and anchored against Gammon's shoulder, and the clouds were soft outside the window, and Sarah was asleep in the row ahead with her new husband's hand in hers, and the world was temporarily, completely manageable. Gammon pressed his mouth to the top of her head. "Stay there. Sleep," he said. She did.